Hello everyone and welcome to the latest edition of the First Thursday Club from RSK Biocensus. My name is John Davis. I'm a director with RSK Biocensus and with their sister companies RSK Wilding and Nature Positive. And today I'm very happy to be introducing you to Andy Greenall, who I'll introduce in a bit more detail in a second, who is going to be talking about Scope 3 greenhouse emissions, basically a rather contentious and thorny issue and rather complicated compared to Scope 1 and 2, which I'm sure he'll talk us through. Andy, if you could just move us on to the next slide. I'll just go through some housekeeping first. So you can scream at the screen as much as you like. We won't hear you. You're all muted. However, your voice can still be heard. If you put any questions into the Q&A box, then I will be going through those questions during Andy's talk, and I'll filter through them and pick out some really nasty ones to ask him at the end. And he's very kindly said that he will answer every question that we don't get to today by email. So don't worry if we don't get to your particular question. And the last thing to say on the housekeeping is that you will receive an email in an hour or so asking for feedback. It'd be great if you could fill that in, especially if you've got any ideas for future talks, for example. We'd be very happy to oblige. So Andy, on to the next slide. I'll just give a very quick introduction. So Andy's a director, also at Nature Positive, and heads up the carbon and sustainability team. And very quickly, he basically does carbon assessments for all sorts of organizations across a wide variety of industries. So you couldn't really have a better person to do this, this introduction to Scope 3 assessments for you. And I think given that you've got a lot to talk about, Andy, I will just hand over to you and take it away. And if you want to turn your camera off, I'll do the same.
Great. Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. Pleasure to have you all here. So very simple agenda today, very much what it said on the door really. So 3 sections. What is Scope 3? I'm not going to labour the point there because I think if you're interested enough in Scope 3 to have signed up and dialed in, you've probably got a fair idea what it actually entails. Why assess and report on it? Why bother? And a bit more time on how. Obviously we need to be realistic about how much detail we can go into on the how, but I hope to cover off some of the main precepts and pitfalls at least, and then we'll have a Q&A and a wrap up at the end there. I suppose I should start with an apology. There's quite a lot of jargon, abbreviation, acronyms, as in every technical sector, so I thought I'd start with a bit of a decoding slide at the beginning. I'll be using the term GHG a lot. Obviously stands for greenhouse gases. Colloquially, we often refer, especially when speaking to carbon footprints out loud. Obviously, the correct term is a greenhouse gas assessment or a greenhouse gas inventory. And carbon is, in this context, shorthand for all the greenhouse gases, not just carbon dioxide. GHGP is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, so an organisation that's one of the, probably the main authority on Scope 3 accounting. PG&S stands for Purchased Goods and Services. That's one of the Scope 3 emissions categories I'll be talking about in a little bit. RO stands for the reporting organisation. That's probably you, so the company that is trying to assess and report on its greenhouse gas emissions, and RP is a reporting period, typically be a year. Scopes 1 and 2 and Scope 3 I'll be talking about a bit more in a second. You've probably come across the science-based targets. If not, I'll be talking about those a bit later too. So SBT stands for a science-based target. In this context, I'm talking about greenhouse gas reduction targets, not to be confused with science-based targets for nature. And the SBTI is a science-based targets initiative, which is the organisation that manages the SBT process. SMEs are small and medium-sized enterprises, and T&D, really confusingly, has 2 different meanings in this context of greenhouse gas reporting. It's transportation and distribution, which effectively means logistics, but it also means transmission and distribution, which is, in broad terms, energy losses from grids or energy networks. And TCFD you'll know about, I imagine. That's the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So what is Scope 3? Well, I suppose it's simple to start by defining it in terms of what it isn't. It's not Scope 1 or Scope 2. Scope 1 is your direct emissions. That's the combustion, the process emissions, the fugitive emissions, the stuff you've got direct control over and you as an organisation are directly responsible for. So that could be natural gas combustion in boilers or diesel in internal combustion engines, refrigerant leaks from your cooling equipment. That's Scope 1. Scope 2, sometimes slightly inaccurately referred to as energy indirect emissions. That's effectively the emissions from the generation or creation of purchased energy, which is electricity and can also be heat, steam, cooling, even compressed air. from your owned and controlled operations. So that's scopes 1 and 2. You never look at those separately. You never just do a scope 1 or just a scope 2 assessment. You'd always look at scopes 1 and 2 together. Scope 3 is just simply none of the above. It's all other greenhouse gas emissions incurred as a result of the business's activities, directly or indirectly, that aren't one of those 2 categories. Goes by a few aliases. It's sometimes referred to as value chain emissions. Corporate value chain is the term the Greenhouse Gas Protocol tends to use. ISO 14069 calls them other indirect emissions, very catchily, sometimes referred to as supply chain emissions as well. Most frameworks would divide them into 2 streams. So upstream scope 3 emissions are those incurred before, in procedural or chronological terms, before the reporting organisation. And then downstream scope 3 emissions are those that come after the reporting organisation. That'll make more sense on the next slide. There's usually around 15 categories. It does depend slightly on which protocol or guidance framework you're looking at. Here's a diagram you might be familiar with. It's a very good clear diagram based on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's corporate standard. So the blue arrow in the middle is that's your direct emissions of scope 1. The grey arrow in the top left is your energy indirect emissions, or scope 2 from purchased energy. Then in the green arrow on the left, you've got your upstream scope 3 emissions, which can include, I'm not going to read them all out, but purchased goods and services and capital goods. So collectively, that's the embodied emissions in the stuff you buy, in very crude terms, whether you're buying it for your own use or you're buying it to make it into a product or you're buying it to sell it on. It includes upstream transport distribution, business travel, employee commuting, working from home, easy to overlook and very topical post-COVID. And then on the right, green arrow, you've got your downstream scope 3 emissions, which are those after your involvement in, as it were, so downstream transport distribution, processing, use, end of life of sold products if you're a product manufacturer, downstream leased assets, and then a couple of quite specific ones, franchises and investments. So there's a couple of main authorities on scope 3 emissions. The first one is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's corporate value chain, brackets scope 3 standard. I assume they didn't call it just the scope 3 standard because the term didn't have a currency at the time it was published that it has now. So that's got 15 different scope 3 categories. Then there's also a less well-known standard, but also one that is worth a look at. It's called ISO 14069, practical guidance for 14064. Sorry, 14063, and that's got 6. It actually doesn't use the term scope 3 at all, but it refers to 16 upper indirect categories. So it adds, and this is one of the material differences between the two, it does specify client and visitor transport. So imagine it'd be a Tesco, or that's the emissions associated with your customers driving to your shop to buy their stuff. And it adds a useful catch-all of any other emissions. So there's no escape from 14069, everything's included. It also, minor technical point, but it considers commuting outside of stream, not upstream. 14069 is currently under review, and it's going to be replaced by a new standard, 14064 Part 4. So a really simple example, let's imagine a hypothetical product manufacturer. Its upstream scope 3 emissions might include certainly would include the material acquisition and pre-processing, effectively the raw material and ingredients for the product, and then transport and distribution thereof to the premises. Scopes 1 and 2 is the production, the refining, the manufacturing, among other things, and then downstream scope 3 would be distribution, storage, getting it out to customers, the use phase by the customers, and then whatever happens to it at the end of its life. So very simple example, obviously, but that's what something might look like if you're a product manufacturer. I'm frequently asked about double counting within the scope 3 value chain. It's a legitimate question, but sometimes the term gets a little bit confused. What you need to be aware of within greenhouse gas accounting, there's 2 possible types of double counting. There's double counting within the same organization, within the same carbon footprint effectively, which is bad and to be avoided. And then there's double counting between organizations. The second one isn't something to worry about, simply because all greenhouse gas reporting potentially involves that second type, the inter-organizational double counting. Perfectly normal and not something to be particularly worried about, simply because your scopes 1 and 2 emissions are your suppliers' downstream scope 3 emissions and your customers' upstream scope 3 emissions. So if your suppliers and your customers are all reporting, then inevitably, if you think about it, there is going to be double counting, but that's okay. It's not anything to worry about. What you do need to try to avoid is double counting within your own greenhouse gas inventory. So for example, counting commuting and company-owned vehicles emissions twice for the same journey, for instance, or double counting between the same purchases between Capex and purchased goods and services. Why Scope 3? Well, why bother with it? Let's ask ourselves that. So it's not yet, big caveat, yet usually captured under most mandatory, certainly government level legislation. I think that's probably going to change, but it isn't currently. Usually, it can be extremely confusing. There's those categories we just looked at. It's pretty nebulous. It can be extremely challenging to get hold of certainly good data, and then once you do get hold of that data, it can be pretty complex and it's time consuming to process it. How you go about it, it's not always that clear. You add all that together, and it gets quite expensive. So why bother with it at all? Well, it's a rhetorical question. Let's start with the obvious first answer, which is possibly you just have to. Even if it's not an out-and-out legal requirement, in the compliance sense, it might very well be a requirement in other senses, and it could certainly be an expectation. So there's compliance with, there's certain voluntary schemes, some of them listed here, that you might choose to sign up to. But once you have signed up, then all sorts of requirements do kick in, often including Scope 3. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the CDP, which used to be known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, GRI, TCFD, various others. And the one on the end there, I thought I'd bring to your attention, lender requirements. It's what we're seeing increasingly in the last few years. It's becoming quite common for if you're looking for investment, then that investment, well, inevitably it's going to come with strings attached, but some of those strings attached might not be around greenhouse gas evaluation and reduction. Customer requirements and pressure. We'll be talking more about science-based targets, which is one of the big drivers behind this expectation. And then it's Scope 3 is just increasingly an expectation in general environmental and social governance reporting now. It's just expected, and it's what a lot of companies are doing. It's good practice. It helps with transparency. So let's imagine you're a fossil fuel company and you're only reporting your Scope 1 and 2 emissions from your nice clean office in London. That's giving a pretty misleading representation of your overall climate impact. So the only way you can address that is by looking at Scope 3 in more detail. You can find and track your carbon emissions hotspots. There's the cliche about you can't manage what you don't measure. Bit of a double-edged sword here, but if done carefully, it can be a useful tool for helping to engage suppliers and identify good practice in your supply chain. There can be reputational benefits. You can report your Scope 3 emissions to help improve transparency, stakeholder reputation. The Carbon Disclosure Project's been a major driver here over the last decade or so. It might help you anticipate future requirement or regulation, because as I said at the top of this slide, I think will be increasingly an expectation. And this I think is the key point above all. Any kind of greenhouse gas management, so that includes measurement, but also includes decarbonisation, it needs to be holistic. It shouldn't just be a question of moving some greenhouse gas emissions off your balance sheet and onto somebody else's. And adopting a sort of Scope 3 holistic mindset is really key to avoid falling into that trap. And because Scope 3 often accounts for certainly the large majority of emissions from many organisations, it's just an absolutely inherent part of any sort of sensible decarbonisation process. I'll just go into a little more detail here around three of the key drivers I touched on the last slide. So the science-based targets, you might not have heard of 2-3 years back, but I suspect you probably have heard of now. They're very much gaining a lot of traction. So if you commit to a science-based target, then if you're a non-SME, which in science-based target initiative definition means a non-subsidiary organisation with more than 500 staff, not 250 as is usual. If you're a non-SME with more than 40% of your total greenhouse gas emissions coming from Scope 3, you have to set a Scope 3 target. You don't have any choice about that if you sign up for an SBT. It's got to cover Scope 3 in those circumstances. You do have a few options about what sort of Scope 3 target you set. It could be an absolute Scope 3 reduction, a relative one in relative to something physical like widgets produced, or economic such as turnover revenue, or if you're particularly ambitious, you could even set a supplier engagement Scope 3 target. And I said that doesn't apply to SMEs, but even SMEs on the Science-Based Target Initiative do need to commit to measuring and reducing their Scope 3 emissions, albeit without actually having a formal reduction target. The target is just any kind of reduction. And what we're seeing a lot of at the moment is the interdependency of Scope 3 emissions I mentioned just now means that the pressure to measure and reduce emissions is pushing up the supply chain. So imagine if you're a big retailer, you sign up for a science-based target, you find that 80% of your emissions are in your supply chain, then the only real way you've got of meeting that target is to share the love, to spread the to push the expectation and requirement for decarbonisation up the supply chain. So if this isn't on your radar yet, there's a pretty good chance it's going to be soon. TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, in its metrics, so it's based on our 4 pillars. One of the pillars is metrics, and in its metrics pillar, it's very specific. It calls on respondents to disclose Scope 1 and Scope 2, and if appropriate, Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions and related risks. Now, you could argue there's a little bit of grey area around that, if appropriate, but bear in mind this goes into the public domain, and I think in 2023, if you consider your holistic emissions not to be appropriate, then sooner or later some questions are going to be asked around that. And then there's the catchily titled PPN 0621, which is UK only, which effectively means UK government organisations, when procuring goods or services worth currently £5 million or more a year, require bidders to make a net zero commitment to publish scopes 1 and 2 plus certain scope 3 emissions, and then create what they call a carbon reduction plan. So there are some pretty hefty drivers, even if not legally mandated yet. And scope 3 comes with opportunities. Its holistic perspective incentivises greenhouse gas reduction. Once you start thinking in terms of the overall value chain, not just your bit of it, you start thinking bigger. There's a growing market for low carbon goods and services. It can help with efficiency and performance tracking. There is a caveat around that I'll come to in a minute. Can improve stakeholder relations. Maybe not so much anymore, but can still help you differentiate a little bit, simply because no one's impressed anymore if you just report your scope 1 and 2 emissions. That doesn't help you stand out. And a really quick comment on what scope 3 isn't for, which is, in my view, interorganisational comparisons. So product carbon footprint assessments and scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions assessments can sometimes, if you're very careful, be used for meaningful comparison between products or between organisations, if you're reasonably confident you're comparing apples with apples. That's not, again, not just my view, not often the case with scope 3, for the very simple reason that the high level and the sheer breadth of a scope 3 assessment and the number of judgment calls and variety of methods that it's going to take to arrive at a number makes it extremely difficult to be confident that you're actually comparing on a like-for-like basis, unless very, very carefully verified. So the most useful scope 3 comparison, in my view, is within the same reporting organisation with yourself, basically over time. How are you doing this year compared to last year, and so on? Not how are you doing compared to your competitors down the road. Right, so we've done the what and the why. Let's talk about how. There's a few sort of golden rules, sounds a bit pompous, but let's go with key points to bear in mind when you're looking at scope 3. First point is that there is never such thing as a definitive, an absolute, a perfect scope 3 assessment. There's always going to be room for improvement, always. And so what you need to take into account is that if you want to improve, there's always an opportunity cost to improving data and reporting accuracy and granularity in one area, and that cost is often going to be at the expense of another area, which means that scope 3 assessments are best approached iteratively. You're not going to get them perfect the first time or the second time. It needs to be considered as part of a sort of multi-year project to zoom in from macro to micro, if you like. And prioritisation is the absolute golden rule. Focus on your main emission sources and don't go down a rabbit hole chasing data around, waste in your head office or whatever. If a high level assessment has shown that that's probably responsible for 0.05% of your total emissions, worry about the big stuff, not the small stuff. So an initial high level assessment, very, very valuable indeed. This is the process we use with our clients. We do an initial high-level assessment to identify the areas of focus to zoom in on in future reporting iterations. But be quite cautious about what claims you make off the back of the initial high-level assessment. It's not necessarily that robust a baseline. I just flagged the Quantis tool at this point. The Quantis tool, you might have come across it. It uses spend-based data to generate a very high-level assessment of your total scope 3 emissions. It's not, and this isn't the criticism of it, because it's not intended to be a tool to produce a really, really robust all scopes carbon footprint. So certainly by all means do an initial high-level screening assessment or something along the lines of the Qantas tool, but be quite cautious about how much work you need to put into refining that before you go public with it and start making claims. How do you prioritise? Well, you want to look at the areas with the most significant greenhouse gas emissions themselves. I think that's pretty obvious. Most relevant to the reporting organisation's business, and those with the best anticipated reduction opportunity. So ideally, you're looking for the sweet spot between all three of these. How do you do that? So the initial screening process for high-level data, what we do with our customers is we effectively talk them through each category, determine whether it's relevant at all. So of the 15 categories, it could be, if you're not a product manufacturer and straight away there's 3 products, three categories, you don't have to worry about any further. We use a red, amber, green system. And then for the categories that are relevant, consider what activity data is or could be available to do a high-level assessment of those categories. But I'll repeat the golden rule: spend more resource on the bigger emission sources. Don't get too sidetracked with something just because it's visible or topical or immediately in front of you. I'm not going to go into detail here, but just to draw your attention to it, there's a very useful table in the Greenhouse Gas Protocols Scope 3 guidance, which sets out some criteria. So some of them are pretty obvious, like size and influence. Outsourcing, I think, is quite an interesting one. So if you are outsourcing activities that are typically performed in-house elsewhere in your sector, then that's certainly a consideration for inclusion in Scope 3 inventory. Quick digression into semantics. It's easy to get confused with the word data in the context of greenhouse gas accounting. What does that actually mean? So you need 2 types of data for greenhouse gas assessments. You need activity data and emissions factors. So activity data is just simply a measure of activity that results in greenhouse gas emissions. And then the emissions factors are multipliers that convert that activity data into the greenhouse gas emissions. Activity data can be primary or secondary. Primary data is that directly relating to specific activities. So if you've got your kilowatt hours of electricity you use, your tons of waste, and you know that firsthand, then that's primary data. Secondary data is high level, so benchmarks and any outputs from modelling you might have done, estimates, proxies, and anything of that nature. Ideally, you want to be using primary data, but as we'll see in a minute, that's not always going to be possible with certainly with certain Scope 3 categories. It's almost impossible to get primary activity data, so you're going to have to do something with secondary. A few key tips. One of your best friends all through the Scope 3 process is the Pareto principle, otherwise known as the 80-20 rule. So this is especially useful for looking at the 2 big supply chain categories, purchase goods and services and Capex. You don't want to try and engage and get really accurate data from every single one of your suppliers. But what you might find as a result of a simple Pareto analysis is that, hey, we find that 50% of our goods and services are procured from a relatively small number of our overall suppliers. Let's engage with those first. Really useful tool. Easy to overlook. You want to make the process, you want to make life as simple as possible for people you're asking for data. So if you just send a blanket email out saying send me your data on commuting, you're probably going to get not terribly helpful reply. But what we do is work with clients to put together a bespoke data capture form. So that acts as guidance for what data needs to be collected, but also helps the people actually doing the collecting. Data collection, like everything about Scope 3, is iterative. So you're reviewing and refining your accuracy for key areas over multiple reporting cycles. So if you think in terms of, say, a commuting survey, you might to survey a relatively small number of people and extrapolate in the first year. And if that does turn out to be a key emission source, then you can go into more detail and get a bigger sample in subsequent years. Whereas if it just turns out to be 0.5% of your total, then perhaps you might find that you're reasonable enough with a high level accuracy. Show your workings. I was getting my GCSE maths teacher's voice in my head at this point. It's not just the number you arrive at, it's how you've arrived at it. You'll need to make a lot of assumptions, you'll need to make estimates, models, you need to rationalize. So you need to document and justify all these judgment calls you've had to make, partly for replicability, so you can be consistent year on year if you need to be, but also so that if you are challenged, you can show what your reason for making that assumption was. a bit of a cliche, but cut the soup to the cloth. So don't be too idealistic in data terms. It's a bit of a jump if you're coming from scope 1 to scope 2, where good activity data is usually quite widely available, often quite widely available. Scope 3, that's not always going to be the case, especially at first. So you need to be realistic and be prepared to work with what you can get hold of. And don't get too concerned with reporting to 6 decimal places. You'll have made reasonably. You'll have had to make a lot of assumptions and estimates, and just beware of what I call the illusion of precision. Just because you can calculate something to 6 decimal places doesn't mean it's necessarily particularly precise. A couple of scope 3 calculation guidance documents, the GHGP value chain standard I've mentioned. That's got some really valuable, quite specific technical advice as a sort of ancillary document. On ISO 14069, which is actually going to be superseded by 14064 Part 4, which is currently in development, but that's pretty good at mapping out what a good, an intermediate, and a poor activity data scenario looks like. They do have a couple of conflicting areas, and just to bring to your attention the fact that the Science Based Targets Initiative does require adherence to follow the greenhouse gas protocol method, so something to bear in mind. A couple of tips on specific scope 3 categories. Easy to get confused by the difference between upstream and downstream leased assets. An upstream leased asset is where you, the reporting organization, is leasing. So easy to accidentally double count between this and scopes 1 and 2. But a good example would be sort of, say, temporary warehouse or storage or some sort of facility where you haven't got operational control. Therefore, arguably, it doesn't fall into your scope 1 and 2, but in that case, it definitely does come under upstream leased assets in scope 3. And the downstream leased assets is where you are the landlord and you're leasing out to someone else, in which case you're looking at a sort of effectively a mini scope 1 and 2 assessment for that asset to fill in the gaps in your scope 3. Use of sold products is a great example of a category where you're never going to get much primary data. You sell 10,000 widgets, you're not realistically going to get primary data on how often those widgets are used and how much energy they consumed. So here, modeling is your friend. You're going to want to model usage scenarios based on typical use patterns and life expectancies of the equipment you're selling. So the GHGP Scope 3 standards specifies that you must include what it calls direct use phase emissions. So that's electricity from electricity using product, for instance, and you are encouraged to add indirect use phase emissions, such as if you're a clothes manufacturer, then at some point those clothes are going to have to be washed, one would hope. If you're producing food, then it's going to need to be cooked. So I would certainly lean towards a more comprehensive inventory here. Business travel. So if you're a company, you've got offices in Singapore and Buenos Aires and London, and you've got a constant stream of executives jetting between the three, spend more time on the aviation and don't worry too much about how many buses it took to get to the airport, that kind of thing. So focus on the bigger areas. Also, don't conflate with scope 1, which is where you own the vehicle. So aviation would usually come under business travel in scope 3 unless you own or control the plane. Investment, you can sometimes clients get a little bit confused here. So what we're talking about in the context of scope 3 category 15 is equity investments in third-party organizations, not internal capital investment, which does come under scope 3, but scope 3 category 2 capital goods. Transport and distribution. So there's an upstream and a downstream transportation and distribution. The difference is upstream is products purchased between your tier 1 suppliers and your own operations, and any other purchased inbound, outbound, intra-company logistics, in the sense purchase in the sense that you've paid for it. Downstream is where you haven't paid for it, so it's not necessarily quite as simple as inbound and outbound. And also, don't conflate it with scope 1, which is where you own and control the vehicles. You own or control the vehicles yourself. Easy to forget to include F gases, which can be quite significant if you're shipping chilled products. If you think about the potential refrigerant losses from the transport. It does also include storage, which is probably going to be immaterial except where things are chilled or refrigerated. And you can, not seen it done much yet, but you can choose to add whole life cycle emissions from the vehicles themselves and the facilities and the infrastructure required for the whole logistics process as well. Just drilling down a little bit further into the two upstream supply chain categories, purchase goods and services and capital goods, there's a few different approaches. So what this shows is there's always going to be a trade-off between the accuracy of the result and the amount of input you need to get the result. So to take a simple approach, you could just use the amount of money you spend on various categories, use simple EEIO, environmentally extended input-output modeling, spend-based emissions factors effectively to arrive at a very quick but probably not particularly accurate output. You could use an average data method for generic products, or you can use a product-specific emissions factor for each of the products. So if you think in terms of, let's say you buy thousands of laptops a year for whatever reason, in the grey box you just find an EEIO emissions factor for IT and multiply your total spend, and that will give you a number very quickly but not particularly precisely. The average data, the blue box, would see you getting the number of laptops purchased and multiplying that by a generic laptop emissions factor, and the supplier specific one would be a more specific emissions factor for the actual laptops you purchased. So more effort, more precise. So there's always a trade-off. For purchase goods and services in Capex, then the multi-stage iterative approach really is important. So start by using spend factors to determine the key hotspots by the category, and then effectively you're zooming into the main areas within the key categories, picking your battles, identify the main suppliers and the products they supply, and then start requesting product or service specific emissions factors for the key products. So what you're looking to do really is replace the generic with the specific emissions factor data over time. And then at the same time as this, you're engaging with your key suppliers around product decarbonisation. You might be engaging to say, look, we're going to be looking for year-on-year carbon reductions in the products that we're purchasing from you next year, for instance. Nearly finished. Just a couple of common errors to avoid. Going into too much detail too soon. It's easy to catch yourself absolutely swimming in data and not really sure what to do with it. Or the opposite, just using quantis or spend-based factors for all categories and then not improving the data over time. It's easy to forget to include work from home emissions, but they are increasingly important, especially post-COVID. Don't confuse upstream and downstream transport and distribution. That's easily done. Amortizing Capex, so writing the carbon associated with capital expenditure off over the lifetime of whatever that capital is. That is permitted under 14064, but it's not under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 3 guidance. Specifically says don't do that. And then some errors, possible errors around double reporting. I think I touched on already. Okay, summary, key messages. So I suppose the main points to take away: if you're not being asked for a Scope 3 inventory yet, you probably will be soon. So it's definitely time to start getting prepared. Because it's so holistic and all-encompassing, prioritization is really, really important to avoid overload. You know, don't be too ambitious too early. View Scope 3 is an iterative process, and your first Scope 3 assessment is always only ever going to be a starting point. You're not going to get it perfectly right the first time, and that's perfectly normal. You're probably not going to get it perfectly right the second time either. It's a multi-year project. And shouldn't need to repeat this, but sometimes I do. Carbon management is ultimately about global greenhouse gas reductions. That's what it's for. So the accounting is only a means to an end. So the number you arrive at the end of your Scope 3 odyssey, that's a starting point, not an end in itself. So obviously the ultimate goal is to bring that number down. Focus on the best emissions reduction opportunities, and don't worry too much about the small beer. So next steps, if you haven't started looking at Scope 3 at all, I'd recommend, well, I would say this because it's my job, but I certainly would recommend starting now with perhaps a 2, 3, 4 year Scope 3 assessment plan. If you have already started, focus on your bigger areas, your carbon hotspots, and getting better data for those. And at the same time as getting better data, work with your suppliers on what the decarbonisation opportunities are. Set a medium-term decarbonisation trajectory, because if you're not being asked for one yet, you will be soon. And then get to work with your key value chain stakeholders on how you can bring those numbers down. John, over to you.
Brilliant. Great stuff. You can hear me okay? Do you want to stick your camera back on, Andy?
Yeah.
Just to pick up on one of your last points there, the key thing here is yes, it's all about measuring your emissions, but the key thing is changing behaviours across your organisation and indeed supply chain. So this is a means to an end, as Andy said. That would be my total, well, my main take-home message to everyone. Okay, unfortunately, Andy,
just
a few questions.
Just to come in there, John. It's really easy to lose sight of that. Not going to name any names, but it's so easy to get involved in the accounting, arriving at the number, that you forget the number itself is just a tool. It's a starting point or a midpoint, but not the end point.
Yeah, and without being too pompous, we're all trying to do the right thing for the climate here, and obscuring things is really not helping anyone. We've all got to kind of pull together. Okay, so I have a few questions. Let's kick off with this one, because this is the way I see it as well. Many companies seem content to put Scope 3 on the too difficult pile. I know I certainly did before I had this talk. How can we change this?
I suppose a couple of points to pick out there. One of them is that, as I hope I've shown, it's not too intimidating, Scope 3, if approached right, i.e. a bit at a time. It only becomes especially scary and intimidating if your expectations are too high around the degree of accuracy you're going to be able to get in the first year or two. And the other point is that I think the decision is going to be made for you. I think the expectation is very much moving towards any company of any size is going to be expected to know it's certainly at high level at Scope 3 emissions pretty soon, if not already.
Okay, next one is there a risk that the fact that you are forever improving your reporting over time will obscure the benefits from changing your emissions related behaviours?
I suppose it could happen, but I wouldn't want to describe it as a risk. I mean, it comes back to the point we made just now. Fundamentally, what we're all here for is to reduce holistic global carbon emissions, and if you're doing that, I suppose you could argue there's a certain question mark over who gets the credit for doing that, but I don't think that's where we need to be as a society and as an economy at the moment.
No, it's interesting. I mean, I think that's an interesting point. It ultimately we're trying to improve behaviours, and if the way you're reporting things is kind of evolving over time, you don't want to get too hung up on how that reporting has changed, as long as it's changing behaviours.
There's always a narrative you can bring in as well. I mean, it's a funny one, because consistency is one of the greenhouse gas protocol's golden rules of carbon footprinting. But actually, with Scope 3, as I hope I've shown, you don't necessarily want to be particularly consistent year on year. Certainly for the first couple of years, you want to be drilling in and getting more and more accurate over time. Yeah, it's a good point.
Right, how rigorous is the accreditation for carrying out Scope 3 reporting, and who might scrutinise the assessment, i.e. is there a regulator to police this?
There isn't a general one, but certain schemes might have their own accreditation requirements. So the CDP, I think there's effectively bonus point, I can't remember the correct terminology, but bonus points within CDP for getting third-party verification of your Scope 3 emissions. And if you're a non-SME and you sign up for a science-based target, you need to provide a reasonably granular greenhouse gas inventory, including Scope 3 and sort of corroborating material, so that they can do a bit of a check to show that they've got confidence in the numbers. But yeah, it's sort of central global level that I'm not aware of anything yet, but that might be a matter of time.
Because this is a key thing, because we want to avoid greenwashing in any sense. So you do need regulation of this, otherwise people are just going to pull the wool over your eyes, especially when you've got companies who sell things who are trying to promote you buying their things because they're net zero and they're sustainable. It does need some regulation.
Absolutely, yeah. I might have laboured the point a little bit, but the whole idea of using Scope 3 for inter-company comparison is something you've got to be so careful about. And of course, marketing departments, as soon as they find out you're looking at your Scope 3 emissions, they immediately want to say, oh, we're greener than our competitor, let's make a big splash of that. And that's not how it works.
Well, unfortunately, it is how it works. It's how it shouldn't work. This is kind of similar to the point we were just making, which is there a risk of spending too much time and money trying to capture all carbon emissions and not spending on actually reducing emissions?
Absolutely, there's really good question. Yeah, absolutely, there is that risk, and what I hope I kept using the word iterative and focusing on the big areas is that there's always an opportunity cost. You know, you could spend £10,000 going into more detail around, you know, getting really good top quality data, waste data, but you could also spend that £10,000 doing some sort of concrete decarbonisation exercise. So there's always a little sort of mini cost benefit analysis to be made for every additional layer of granularity you want to go into, and that's, yeah, increased accuracy shouldn't be the goal for its own sake. I mean, I'd never argue against considering increasing your accuracy, but it's never the be all and end all.
No, otherwise, you know, the planet will go down the Swanee whilst a load of consultants make a lot of money.
Yeah, we're sitting here stroking our chins and staring at spreadsheets, and yeah, I mean, it shouldn't need saying, but it is fundamentally about decarbonisation, not just carbon counting.
Yeah, it's a means to an end, absolutely. And if all that happens is you don't measure it in masses of detail, you only do the high level stuff, at least if that massively changes, you know, how you source things from your supply chain, or how many flights you take as a company, then you're making a difference. And that's what it really has to do. I think that's really
absolutely, yeah. And even quite high level assessments can yield some very, very interesting results. You know, I've often seen clients go, oh, well, did not know that. You know, something you've never really given any thought to, like, you know, commuting or business travel that's just considered to be baked in, and so suddenly companies have to start thinking about.
And even if that's a very high level assessment and the detail and the accuracy isn't necessarily there, if it's clear, it's an absolute standout, this is one of your major emissions factors, then there's no harm in it not being that accurate, as long as it triggers you to actually do something about it.
Absolutely.
Right, we've only got a couple of minutes, so here's another one. Should we include emissions from pension investments? So that's a proper, is that downstream or upstream?
that's downstream category 15, so that comes under investments. I suppose the honest answer is yes, because it's technically an investment, but that's an investment carbon footprinting is a whole quite specialized kettle of fish by itself. Pensions would be particularly challenging, because I would assume, not a finance expert myself, but I'd assume a portfolio would be very, very broad. So you're not going to, you know, if you invest in 5 companies, it's logistically quite possible to get a carbon footprint for each of those 5 companies and just divvy it up by your own equity share. Whereas if you're a pension fund, your investments are probably measured in the hundreds or thousands, I should think. That becomes a bit more challenging. You can see you'd be looking at some sort of software-based modeling in the first instance, I should think.
But I mean, that is a really good question, because, you know, all of us invest a huge amount of money in our pensions, and changing the way those pensions are, you know, delivered, and what they invest in and how they make their money. You know, we've done it here at RSK, where we've changed our pensions to a much more sustainable group of companies, and very deliberately. And, you know, that was around environment as well as climate. So I think it is a really, really good place to focus, because you make a massive difference by doing that. Okay, we're just about at the end there then. So I think I'll just say that there are 2 or 3 more other questions, but we'll get those. I'll ping those over to you, Andy, and you can answer those by email if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thanks very much again for that. That was really very informative. I feel I know more about Scope 3 than I ever thought I would. 3 final things to end on. One, if I could just say to everyone, you will be sent an email with the feedback form. So do please fill that in if you can. That'd be great. The next First Thursday Club is on the 1st of June. And the title there, kind of related actually, is Spotting Greenwashing Awareness and Avoidance Tactics. And that's with Jenny Hughes and Sid Hugrand from the Nature Positive team again. And the final thing to say is that we've got a whole load more talks that we've done over the last year and a half, 2 years. So if you are interested in various topics in the environmental area, I'm sure we've done a talk on one. So have a look at the website and skim through the talks that have been given in the past. I think it's a pretty useful resource. Okay, so without further ado, thanks again, Andy.
Thanks, Joe.
Look forward to seeing you all on the next call, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Excellent.